Hi guys, this video is going to walk you through how to make a unit circle out of a paper plate or just a cutout circle out of paper. So here are some materials you will need. You will need some pens. I choose different colors. I think it's helpful to have different colors of pens. You'll need to have a ruler or a straight edge of some kind, a pair of scissors. If you have a wire cleaner, that's best. If you don't, this was a paper clip that I unfolded. Whatever you use for that though, it needs to be at least the length of the radius of the circle. So that's your guide. So that's why I said this was one of those like kind of bigger paper clips that I undid. I'm not sure if a smaller paper clip would be long enough, but it needs to be the length of the radius of your circle. Okay, once you have all your materials, oh sorry, one more thing I have is I have this unit circle that I printed out from the notes packet. It's a unit circle that you can find really anywhere, but have that also with you. So the first thing you're going to do is take your paper plate or circle or whatever it is and fold it up into eighths. So I'm going to fold it in half, I'm going to fold it in half again, and then I'm going to fold it in half again, and I'm going to try to crease it along those lines. I've tried to make my folds as as close to being perfect as I could, but you know what, it does not have to be perfect, so whatever you have is fine. Okay, so you have that circle, open it back up. When you open up your circle, take your marker and draw a line on each of those folds. So you should have 8 sections in your paper plate. The next thing to do in your paper plate is remember that the quadrants, this is the first quadrant, second quadrant, third quadrant, and fourth quadrant. And we use Roman numerals when we label those quadrants. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. Also, let's go around the circle and put in degrees. And we're counting by 45 degrees. So this is 45, 90, 135, 180, 225, 270, and 315, and finally back to 360. Here I have a starting point at 0 degrees, and I have my ending point at 360. It's important for today that you have both of those, the 180 and the 360. The 0 and the 360. I put my 0 on top because we're going this way and coming back to this. Remember, when we deal with trigonometry, if you remember this from geometry class, we go counterclockwise. So you have to get used to going counterclockwise on that 45, 90, 135, etc., as well as the quadrants 1, 2, 3, and 4. So that's the direction we're going. Fill that out. Okay, this is where our pipe cleaner is going to come into play. If you have a pipe cleaner, but like I said, if you don't, can you get a paper clip and unfold the paper clip? This is a bigger paper clip. It needs to be at least as long as the radius, but then you do want to cut it off there. And so that's where your scissors come in. Or if you have wire cutters, that's good too. Or you know what, you could just bend it over because let's just do that. Let's just bend it over because we're actually going to use that bend part later. So anyway, in some way, you need to get your wire or your pipe cleaner so that it is long as the radius. Okay, because here's the deal. Once you get it to that length, let's kind of bend it a little bit to give it a little bit of a curve, not a lot. This is maybe curved too much because what I want to do is I want this curve to match the curve of the plate, so I've curved it too much. Okay, now my curve pretty well matches the curve of the plate, so that's good. So that's what I want. Because here's the deal. When it is straight, we call it a radius, but when it's curved and lying along the edge of the circle, it no longer is called a radius, it's now called a radian. And so the word has changed from radius when it's straight to radian when it's curved. Okay, here's what I want you to do next is I want you to count how many times this radian can fit around the circle. So just like go around the circle and see how many times it fits on there. Okay, let me talk about a couple things about the radians. First of all, on my paper plate, I went ahead and made a mark for a radian. That is for reference so that you can kind of understand how big is a radian. You know, people talk about a radian, well, how big is it? This shows you how big that radian is. So that's one thing. That is a radian. I made that mark there. Probably go ahead and let's make that mark because we're going to talk about that also. But the other thing I did is when I counted around, I didn't mark every radian, But I did mark that that was 1, and then I went all the way around, and I got over here to 6. And hopefully you got 6 point something for your measure. And when I do that now, this little piece, how much is that? It's 6 and a little bit, okay? So what this means is I have a radian. If I was going to say how many radians are in one circle, you'd say 6 point something. 6 point something radians are in a circle. Well, 6 point how many? Well, if you've dealt with circles at all, then there's a number that occurs frequently with circles, and that number is pi. How big is pi? Well, it's 3.14. Well, guess what? There are 6.28 radians in a circle. 6.28 is 2 pi. So I'm going to write a couple more things on my plate. One thing I'm going to write on here is that 360 degrees is equal to 2 pi radians. That's one thing I want on there. Another thing I'm going to tell you is, I don't know if you can read my handwriting, but that 1 radian is approximately equal to 57 degrees. And if we look at where that is, I'd go with that. 57 degrees. If that's 45, that's about 57 degrees. And so 1 radian is 57 degrees, and 1 circle is 2 pi radians. Okay, now we need to start thinking in terms of fractions. So we're going to kind of break out your mental fraction skills. So if 2 pi radians is 360 degrees, how many radians would be in 180? It would just be pi radians, right? Okay, well, what's half of that? Half of that would be half a pi, or pi over 2. So pi over 2 goes with the 90 degrees. So a half a radian, a whole radian, and then 2 pi over here. So what's down at the 270? Down at 270 would be 1.5 pi. And the way we do that is we say 3 pi over 2. So 3 pi over 2 radians goes here. So you are going to be asked to memorize basically these major stops along the way on this unit circle. So this pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi are ones that you definitely need to memorize. But we also need to memorize the 45 degrees as well as the 30s and the 60s. Now, I didn't put the 30s and the 60s on here because we can't fold, I can't fold paper that well. But it is on the back of the notes packet, and so we'll talk about that in just a minute. But we need to fill in the fractions for these like 45 degree stops. So let's think about that. If this is pi over 2 and this is halfway, then this must be pi over 4, right? So that's pi over 4. We come over here, halfway between a half and a pi, that's a 1 pi, is 3/4 pi. Let me also talk about fractions. When you do fractions like this, I did 3/4 pi. I said 3/4 pi, but I wrote it 3 pi over 4. You can write it either way. You can write the 3 pi over 4, or you can write 3/4 with a pi out to the side. It means the same thing in terms of the fractions. Okay, let's come down here. Between the 1 and 1.5 would be 1.25. 1.25 is 5 pi over 4. And between the 1.5 and the 2 would be 1 3/4. And so 1 3/4 is 7 pi over 4. Okay, so once again, you will be asked to memorize these. At some point in your mathematical career, you will be asked to memorize these stops along the way. Now, let me also talk briefly about the other ones, the 30s and the 60s. So here I have filled in these. You'll notice that I have my pi's, like pi over 6, pi over 4, pi over 3, etc., filled in. You just have to be able to count by fractions. So for instance, when I split these up, like these 30 and the 60, I'm splitting up into thirds, because it goes 30, 60, 90, right? So there's 3 sections. So if this is pi over 2, then a third of that is pi over 6. So we count pi over 6, 2 pi over 6, which is a third, 3 pi over 6, which is a half, 4 pi over 6, 5 pi over 6, 6 pi over 6, 7 pi over 6, 8 pi over 6, 9 pi over 6, 10 pi over 6, 11 pi over 6. So all we're doing is counting by 1/6. 1 6, 2 6, 3 6, 4 6, 5 6, 6 6, 7 6, 8 6, 9 6, 10 6, and 11 6, and then up to 12 6. But then we just reduce those, but all we did was count by 1/6. So to get the 30s and the 60s, you count by 1 6, 2 6, 3 6, 4 6. To get the 45s, you count by 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, 4/4, etc. When you fill these in, realize that these are all over the internet. If you just go and Google for unit circle, you'll get all this information. But I think it's important for us, the important thing for today was to understand that the radius, when it's straight, is called a radius. But then when we curve it, it's called a radian. And the length of one radian is basically about 57 degrees. And there are 6.28 radians in a circle. That is, there are 2 pi radians in a circle. Okay, that is just a very basic introduction, but like I said, we will work on memorizing those. There are different apps online that I can link to that can help you to memorize some of those stops.